Welcome. My name is Dan Vera, and I'd like to welcome you all watching live or in the after recording to this streamed reading and conversation, Queer Poetics, presented by Red Hen Press and Graywolf Press, featuring two poets from the Central American diaspora, Francisco Aragón and Roy Guzmán, reading from their recent books and engaging in a conversation that touches upon their new books, Queer Poetics. After both poets have read, we'll have a moderated discussion on the aspects, role, language, and significance of queerness in poetry. And because no conversation occurs in a vacuum, because all conversations are permeable and impacted by the realities we are all living in, we want to take a moment to acknowledge that our conversation this evening takes place in the midst of great pain and fury over the killings of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and the protests and the killing of Tony McDade, a Black trans man killed by police in Tallahassee, Florida. And exploring queer poetics, we dedicate this conversation to the continuing call for a more just reality for all people in our society. I've been lucky to know both of tonight's featured writers. I've appreciated their work and dedication to the page. I've been delighted to publish their poetry in the past, and I'm honored to be able to moderate this discussion with two poet friends I greatly admire. In our conversations around tonight's reading, Francisco suggested a poem of mine as a possible framing device for some of the dynamics we hope to explore. This poem was published in my first book and was recently republished on the Poetry Foundation's website. Francisco was kind enough to quote from it as an epigraph for a recent chapbook of his. The poem is titled, "For Some Executors of Gay Writers." For some executors of gay writers, for the manuscript you kept locked up in a wall safe, for the diaries you made sure would not be discovered, for the letters from lovers you burned in the furnace, for the measures you took to tear out their tongues, for all of the ways you straightened the record, for the zeal with which you smothered all knowledge, for condemning the lovers to eternal silence. May you see their faces in each morning, in each mirror you gaze in. May the names of their loved ones ring in your ears. May you wake in the night to the sound of their fucking and be forced to lose sleep to all of their groans. May the pages you hide catch fire from their smoldering till the wall safe explodes and consumes your house whole. May you escape to find your charmed life in ruins. May you call out in grief, but hear nothing but silence. As tonight's readers present their work, it seems important to acknowledge that while these are two poets presenting two sets of poetry, in some ways they are coming from different angles of the same lens, or more appropriately to the Pride Month about to be born, they are prisms capturing different shades and wavelengths of queer plenitude. This is work that rewrites, restores, reimagines, and reunites us with a more whole understanding of queer history, queer present, queer experience, queer resistance, and in general, their own undeniable queerness of being. Francisco Aragón is a son of Nicaraguan immigrants, a native of San Francisco, California. He holds degrees in Spanish from UC Berkeley and NYU. Upon his return to the United States in 1998, after a decade in Spain, Aragón completed graduate degrees in creative writing from UC Davis and the University of Notre Dame. In 2003, he joined the faculty of the University of Notre Dame's Institute for Latino Studies, where he established Letras Latinas. A Canto Mundo Fellow and a member of the Macondo Writers Workshop, Aragón is the author of 3 books, Puerta del Sol and Glow of Our Sweat, as well as editor of the anthology The Wind Shifts, New Latino Poetry. After Ruben, his 3rd book, was released on May 5th of this year by Red Hen Press. His Tongue, A Swath of Sky, his 4th chapbook, was released in 2019. Previous chapbooks include Tertulia, In Praise of Cities and Light, Yogurt, and Strawberry Milk. His poems and translations have appeared in various print and online journals, as well as numerous anthologies. His work as a translator includes 4 books by Francisco X. Aragón, as well as works by Spanish poets Federico García Lorca and Gerardo Diego. More recently, he's been rendering versions of the Nicaraguan poet Rubén Darío. He has read from his work widely, including at universities, galleries, and bookstores, and has been a featured poet at the Split This Rock Poetry Festival and the Dodge Poetry Festival. Aragón spends the fall semester each year on the Notre Dame campus, where he teaches a literature course on Latinx poetry, and spring in Washington, D.C., where he teaches a poetry workshop featuring the work of local and visiting Latinx poets. Francisco Aragón.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here, a pleasure to be sharing this moment with both you and Roy. In November of 2012, Arizona State University issued a press release announcing the acquisition of a privately held collection of manuscripts created by Nicaraguan poet Rubén Darío. The collection consists of 900 or so handwritten pages of poetry, essays, stories, and personal letters, 9 of which revealed for the first time an intimate relationship between Darío and famed Mexican poet Amado Nervo. Shortly after ASU made its announcement, the Nicaraguan novelist Sergio Ramirez published an article in which he denounced the letters as fake. What follows is an epistolary poem in the voice of Rubén Darío from the grave to set the record straight. July 21st, 2013. Dear Sergio, your depiction in Margarita, How Beautiful the Sea, of my homecoming to León in 1907, once again filled my arms with bouquets that dampened my silk suit, baskets of flowers and fruit, which I accepted with a nod, though leaving them in the hands of my entourage, a cambric handkerchief wiping the sweat dripping down my face and neck. And as I opened a path for myself, village folk pressing around, their lips at my sleeves, a little boy with curly hair led the way, clutching the flag of Nicaragua. I loved how you had Momotombo years later in 1916 blow, moments after I drew my last breath, the volcano producing a deep rumbling, sending people into the streets, a spatter of sparks lighting the sky. I wasn't aware, of course, of what came next, your novel placing me there in that room, the doctor's scalpel blinking like a star in the moment it traced the incision on my forehead, my scalp folded back, the saw's fine teeth biting into cranium, he feverishly snipping ligaments, holding in his hands my brain. Seconds later, proclaiming, here it is, the private vessel of the muses. More than cringe, I blushed at being handled with such care. Perhaps you're surprised by this letter? You shouldn't be. Anything is possible in this racket of ours. But artful is not how I'd describe that piece you penned last November. You see, those letters to Amado were real. I bargained with myself, rewrote them to preserve them precisely because I knew what would happen. You know as well as I. He would have destroyed them after reading them. What will people say? He, with wife and children, held sway. I was in New York shortly after New Year's in 1915, heading home when I wrote to him one more time. But you were right, and I'm mildly embarrassed to admit it. I told a little lie on those sheaths of Hotel Astor stationery in Times Square. The poem I enclosed wasn't composed in Barcelona expressly for him. It was a piece of juvenilia, I know, but one I had a soft spot for, and which I retitled and dedicated to him. It was a running joke between us, sending each other our fluff. And yet, it's ironic, Sergio. Thank you for being complicit, for hinting at my understory. How did you manage to nail those final hours? I was indeed lying curled up on my side, wrapped in a thick gray blanket, snoring lightly, my mouth slightly open as my fingers gripped the silver crucifix that Amado, yes, Amado Nervo, had given to me in Paris when we shared that apartment in Montmartre, and that I always carried with me. I'd like to think that somehow you knew and know this truth. I'm waiting for the day when you, the world, stop fighting it. I am dead, and the dead are very patient. Love, Ruben. Winter hours. After Rubén Darío's De Invierno. Look at him curled in a large plush chair, wrapped in sable fur, fireplace glowing just beyond, the angora nosing the fabric of his shirt, a porcelain vase beside the folding screen, draped with silk, his eyes subtle filters allowing sleep to seep through. He enters in silence, takes off his gray coat, pecks the slender rose of his face, the fleur de lis. Amado wakes, smiles, snow, general over Paris. And I want to close by reading the final couple of paragraphs from my essay, My Ruben, part 3 of the essay, which deals with the whole series of the Rubén Darío Amado Nervo controversy, if you will. I'd like to think the Rubén Darío of the 9 letters to Amado Nervo completes this braid. In the words of literary scholar Alberto Acereda at the end of his piece in Bulletin of Spanish Studies, quote, "These letters offer us a Darío and Nervo who are even more human, more passionate than what we imagined." Close quote. The question to be answered in the years to come is, will it be the Ruben Darío of this completed braid that fully blossoms, that comes to occupy, without controversy, his place alongside Federico García Lorca, Luis Cernuda, Vicente Alexandre, Amado Nervo, José Lezama Lima, and Francisco X. Alarcón, to name half a dozen Spanish-language poets as among this linguistic tradition's distinguished mariposa voices. With that, Ruben will have the last word, though with a caveat. Darío took his last breath while gripping a rosary given to him by Amado Nervo, and yet he chose not to include in an anthology of his work, whose selections he himself oversaw, a sonnet titled Amado Nervo. Was it perhaps a conflicted effort to draw attention away from who may have been the love of his life? Regardless, here is a snippet, addressed perhaps to Nervo himself. Generoso y sutil como una mariposa, encuentra en mí la miel de que soy capaz, y goza en mí la dulce fragancia de la rosa. Both ample and nuanced as a butterfly, in me you'll find the nectar I can become. Enjoy in me the sweet scent of a rose. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francisco. And now Roy. Roy G. Guzmán is an Honduran poet whose first collection, Catarachos, is now out from Graywolf Press. Raised in Miami, Florida, Roy is a recipient of a 2019 grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. In 2017, they were named a Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Poetry Fellow. They're also the recipient of a 2017 Minnesota State Arts Board Initiative grant, the 2016 Gazelle Award for Excellence in Poetry, and in 2016, a Scribe for Human Rights Fellowship, focusing on issues affecting migrant farm workers in Minnesota. That same year, they were chosen to participate in the 4th Letras Latinas Writers Initiative Gathering, sponsored by Letras Latinas, the literary initiative at the University of Notre Dame's Institute for Latino Studies, in partnership with the Virginia Piper Center for Creative Writing and the MFA program at Arizona State University. Roy returned to Arizona as a Letras Latinas scholar in 2018. Their work has been included in the Best New Poets 2017 anthology, guest edited by Natalie Diaz, and Best of the Net 2017, guest edited by Eduardo C. Corral. Roy has also twice participated in the Poetry Incubator, sponsored by the Poetry Foundation and Crescendo Literary. After the Pulse nightclub massacre in Orlando, their poem, Restored Mural for Orlando, was turned into a chapbook with the help of poet and visual artist D. Allen to raise funds for the victims. With poet Miguel M. Morales, Roy edited the anthology Pulso, in remembrance of Orlando, published by Damaged Goods Press. They have been a recipient of a GRPP Graduate Research Fellowship to investigate trauma caused by violence in the migration from Honduras, and a second GRPP Graduate Research Fellowship to travel to Honduras for research. Roy holds degrees from the University of Minnesota, Dartmouth College, the University of Colorado, Chicago, and the Honors College at Miami-Dade College. They currently live in Minneapolis, where they are pursuing a PhD in Cultural Studies, Comparative Studies in Discourse and Society at the University of Minnesota. Roy G. Guzmán.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that introduction. And Francisco, what a lovely reading. I'm sure we're going to be able to talk about it during our conversation. And I want to thank, of course, Red Hen Press for putting this event together with Graywolf Press. I'm going to read for you 3 poems that come out of Catrachos. It just came out May 5th. So there are 2 poems that are titled Queerdactyl. And Queerdactyl is part of a series that sort of goes in and out of the book. It tackles lots of different, sort of issues related to queerness, but some of the things that you should know is that the queer dactyl, there's more than one creature called the queer dactyl, and there's a mama queer dactyl who she's a main character in the book, and then there's another character that goes by different names. One of them is Dude Steroid. And so just imagine sort of like this landscape of these creatures that are sort of like trying to basically have a final moment, perhaps, or trying to avoid this idea of extinction. So one of them is called Queer Dactyl. Queer Dactyl. Woke up like strangulated terracotta empress. Woke up like measled Fantasia sewage. The gold mines are revamped. We've defaulted on our loans. Self-portrait as co-opted ravine. Dishwashing roaches in mold. This song has blown piñatas, conga lines of those disappeared. Why won't you gob your empathy for this killing? We believe in mortal flight, and so our deaths are suspended, obedient escalade. We rummage through Icarus's bravery as if we were not ourselves tumbling through the meteorological chaos of our own ancestry. I have stared into the eyes of someone with borrowed skin, borrowed name, servant to the wrong verge of the river. She nodded her hair to the strobe lights as gaffs passed her body undeterred. Later, she smeared her gloom on the outside walls of the earth. Some will say that is how history begat history. I'll say, glory to fate's incorrigible nature, and toward which we violently stroll. The second poem I'm going to read is part of another, it's a shorter series called Marrow. There's about 3 poems titled Marrow in this collection. And Marrow is a character in the X-Men universe. So lots of comic books and comic book characters appear in this collection. She's also known as Sarah. She's a member of what you call the Morlocks. And the Morlocks is a tribe of mutants considered outcasts even among mutants. Marrow's powers allow her to sprout bones from her body, which she can then brandish for self-defense. So this is one of the poems inspired by Marrow. Marrow. The two-hearted spirit spider generates blood portraitures out of lies, which in due course mutate into forked tongues in my mouth. Those daggers I am too hesitant to brandish. Poets often speak of the residual pain left behind when language has been fractured. But how little we understand where to mend the cartilage, restitch our ghosts. Sarah, you are the mutants are too ashamed to mention. La maricona, la pata, la bullet-riddled puta, bystander of mauled angels, one of those bastard superheroes who owe the earth nothing. Your social worker writes down. She demonstrates exemplary movement of the Aristotelian model: exposure, rising shame, crown of thorns, bastardization, the metaphysical resolution. I fell in love with a man once who was forced as a child to swallow his own vomit when he couldn't eat anymore. The failure of lime bricks when some cuts won't bleed. Every evening after sex, I could hear the whirring of the blender. Bone, prayer, bone, prayer, bone, prayer, bone, prayer, bone, prayer. Nothing has boundaries in the ways I am willing to worship. Who cares for baptism when the body is excess holiness waiting to combust? And the last poem I'll read is also titled Queeradactyl. Queeradactyl. With droopy but work it girl wings, Queeradactrix couldn't find the restroom amidst all that burning sulfur in the air, a mirror of soot on the dance floor to gaze at the unknown, though the unknown was passé. They say dead languages roam in those who linger during after hours, but I'm still keeping count of the burials our mothers never had, because death is also an unsent love letter. When the ground erupted under toothless seas, our ecosystems were preparing for the real masquerade ball, absolving a dream whose beginning had gone missing, requiring expertise in misplacement. The holiest of beds I have laid in have had my own reflection to crush and console. The first time our planet went numb with melancholy, Versadactyl, learned in the art of flying with a limp and strut, couldn't match the order of the Mayan calendar. Our storytellers tell us that lizards fell like Babylons under the viral inquisition, that the growing of a dream tasted sweeter when guzzled from above before it poisoned even the shadows, always the last to die. Let's say that what results from abandonment is also miraculous. Even when the fairy angels couldn't rummage for food, they still had their own instincts for sustenance. I have seen children hoard entire nations of giants for a peek at the night sky. I have also heard their giggles in my own solitude afterward. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're all back. Thanks so much, both of you, for those wonderful readings. Let's see. I think we imagined this as sort of a conversation of questions about both of your collections. I'll start with you, Francisco. One of the fascinating aspects of your book is the way in which it weaves back and forth between historical texts and, specifically, for lack of a better term, queer texts. Weaving Jack Spicer or placing Jack Spicer's into Ruben Dario's mouth, for example. Was this an element? I mean, how early was this an element of the project? And did you conceive it as a conversation between periods and generations? And how'd you go about that kind of historical interpolation? Just
I think when I wrote the poem that I read tonight, the epistolary poem, and I put Jack Spicer in there, that allowed me to, I mean, having Jack Spicer in the poem allowed me to get to the title of my book, because one of my favorite Jack Spicer books is his book called After Lorca. And it was that process of naming the book after Ruben that got me to thinking about your question. Then that's when I began to see this book as adding to that queer lineage, which would include, now I argue, Ruben Dario, Lorca, Jack Spicer, myself. So I do think it's a book that fosters conversation between voices, both living and dead.
Well, there's also that aspect of reading the text and recognizing, I mean, it's sort of a literary gaydar where you sort of pick up little points of what's the term used? The mariposa, voices. I mean, was that part of the conception as much?
I think discovering that archive that ASU acquired is what basically allowed After Ruben to have sort of the queer thread. As you may recall, the book that precedes After Ruben, Glow of Our Sweat, in some ways that whole project was even more queer. But I think the Ruben Dario letters to Amado Nervo really is what gave the book a whole different tenor, because prior to discovering those letters, I had already been translating versions of Ruben Dario. And in fact, the second poem that I read tonight, Winter Hours, an earlier version of that poem had the pronoun her. Look at her. The original Spanish language version of that poem actually names the her as someone called Carolina. And so my version of the original poem has the speaker say, look at her. But in the wake of learning about these letters that Ruben Dario wrote to Amado Nervo, that allowed me to revisit some of those translations, such as Winter Hours, and to fiddle with some of the pronouns. And at that point, the project of queering Ruben Dario began to sort of accumulate and become one of the agendas, if you will, of the project.
Yeah. And I also want to say, Roy, if you want to jump in too, I don't want this to be just a, yeah, the other thing that I love too is that one of the other, you didn't read it tonight, but one of the poems is the translations, Neruda's poem about Walt Whitman. And of course, I think for people who aren't versed in Spanish literature, I mean, the idea of treating, or not treating, but recovering Dario as a queer writer is, it's hard to sort of, like, he is such a important figure in the firmament that it's like the foundations tremble, by suddenly, and then of course, the poem you read was kind of a direct response to the establishment just recoiling in horror that not just any poet, but this foundational poet would have the lavender tinge, as they use to talk about other poets. But also it made me think about the appropriateness even around Whitman, who, his queerness isn't in question now, but of course, he went through, there were half a century of scholarship that refused painstakingly who changed pronouns and tried to guess who the lady was that he was in love with, because they just could not stand the fact that, who was the number code that ended up being Peter Doyle that whole time. So it is interesting that it's something that we constantly have to sort of push up against.
Well, one of the anecdotes I like to tell about this project, shortly after this story broke to the surface, is I was having lunch in Washington around 2013 or so with a Nicaraguan poet, a local poet from here in the DC area. And when I mentioned the Rubén Darío Amado Nervo controversy, if you will, this person's reaction, which surprised me, was something like, "Oh, that Darío Nervo thing is just an effort to ensuciar his name." She used the verb ensuciar, which means to soil. And that's when I began to realize, wow, this is really something that I want to take on. And it reminded me, as I mentioned this in the essay, it reminded me of what happened with Lorca for many years. Lorca's family was very reticent about claiming his queerness, and it took his Sonnets to Dark Love didn't even become officially public until 1985, decades and decades after his death.
And there's still some, I mean, there's still some conversation about more material from Lorca that maybe, there's sort of, that's sort of always a question around the inheritors or the estates of queer poets after they're gone. I
was going to add a little bit to also talking about Francisco, because I love the ways in which you're doing, if ensuciar is to queer, I mean, you're queering the archive, right? And you're queering our understanding of history and our understanding of our ancestors. And something that I find very interesting in the way that you translated, as you pointed out, Dan, the Walt poem, it's really interesting because I came into translation by way of Rubén Darío. And for me, Rubén Darío was for so long represented like that young, youthful poet that was trying to experiment with so many things, and then ends up, quote unquote, modernizing Latin American poetry. But something that, in you speaking, you're actually reminding me that Rubén, he pays so much attention to like the physiognomy of a lot of people. Like somehow a lot of these odes, like, as with the Walt Whitman poem, but there are other poems I remember from Azul where he's actually talking about the muscularity of of a person, of a man. And there's this whole connection between muscularity, which has this sort of like, I guess, Greek sort of like neoclassical kind of appreciation between the muscularity with the mind. And it's interesting because it feels like, when I think about those poems, there is a lot of bouncing back between the physical appearance of the person he's like writing an ode to, and also like the mind, the intellect and the body.
One of the poems I include in the book is a poem titled Symphony in Gray, which is just a direct translation. And in that poem, the speaker is sort of gazing at this sailor and his biceps and his athlete's body. And I remember when I reading that poem before the Amado Nervo letters came to the fore, I remember thinking about that poem. He seems to really be focusing a lot on the masculine physique here. And that began to make me wonder. Yeah.
There's also that aspect that the recovery is also not only in the face of the tragedy sort of inherent in or one of the tragedies inherent in it is the reality that the recovery isn't only in the face of sort of this desire for some to maintain this hetero orthodoxy, but also the fact that many of these writers felt they had to change the pronouns. They had to hide them. Whitman, of course, and even in the face of contemporaries knowing, and we know through their correspondence. It's and part of it is also kind of this ability. There's that aspect. There's this aspect biographically that I remember. I want to say it's. I think about Achi Ovejas. One of her memoirs, the title was "We Didn't Come All the Way from Cuba for You to Dress Like This" or something. And but this aspect that somehow that many many parents have when you come out, which is that this is some American thing that they caught. And part of that is, the power in sort of doing this kind of reclamatory work is that it allows you to see yourself in a cultural context and a historical context that you still exist in, so for me, I came out to my mother and she was askance and we didn't speak for a period. And then at a certain point, I won't go into the long story, but there was a film from Cuba that Fresco Chocolate, this kind of gay film out of Cuba that came.
I remember that movie.
And it's a great film. And the gay protagonist in that, there's a gay protagonist, a straight protagonist.
Yeah.
There's this soliloquy that, or this monologue that the gay character gives about sort of the cultural aspects, the cultural figures, writers and composers.
He talks about Les Amalima, I think I remember.
Yeah, right. That's right. Les Amalima's in there, and Lecona and all these people. And I remember watching that in the theater. It's one of these experiences where it's been subtitled, and so you're laughing a second before the rest of the audience laughs. But it's just kind of litany of Cuban writers that the revolutionary straight character doesn't recognize. And the gay character is sort of, que lástima, how sad that he doesn't recognize these cultural characters. But I'm sitting there because I suddenly realized that it's never brought up as an aspect of the list of characters that he's mentioning, the people that he's mentioning. But all the people he mentions are actually queer Cuban writers and intellectuals. That's not what the piece is about, but it's hidden. So if you know that those are all queer writers, it's there. And I sat there kind of blown away because I realized that the reason I knew that all those queer Cuban figures were gay was because my mother, in telling me about these people, about Lecona and about Les Amalima, would always say, "Oh, este es Les Amalima. This is Les Amalima, the great writer. Era un poco raro." And so, he's a little rare, he's a little odd, and that of course was code, and I remember immediately wanting to get out of that theater and call my mother and say hey, you never think that your mother's going to basically give you the directory of, but I also acknowledge that as this kind of rare instance where for my mother, that was even though she was aware of queerness in a way, she had blocked that from what her own son had just told her. And that was an amazing breakthrough that so few cultures out, it's gay consciousness and history is so incredibly white and dominantly white and American and Northern European that it's so rare to get that experience. And so that's why I think this work of reclamation is just so important and life affirming. Roy, switching over to you. I was struck by there's this aspect in your book which is this methodical world building that takes place in Catarachos, and I really loved how you painstakingly build layers of meaning kind of in the poems, and then it's as if the poems themselves are building upon, one upon the other to create a reality or present a reality, even though you're going back and forth in time. And then there's sort of interspersed with these wonderful queerdactyl poems. I'm glad you said a little bit about sort of the different figures in them. But I love those interjections because I think there's 13 of them in the book, but by my count. And I was a little curious about how you conceive them in the what the relationship was to the rest of the manuscript. I loved your sort of describing the different characters. I almost kind of I kept thinking of it as with that what was it, dinosaur discourse, that that they were not so much one figure but different members of the species, but could you say a little bit more about sort of how that, if that developed in tandem with kind of the world you were creating in the rest of the manuscript?
Yeah. I think the one I'm going to get more specific to to your question, thank you so much for that reading. One of the things that I'm thinking about, especially with what you were saying with the raro, right, the mom, I think so much about coded language and the ways in which moms, right, Latina moms, especially painstakingly take all these synonyms, right, as a way to kind of like, surround the aura of something that they're not exactly calling it, what it is, call it queer, call it gay, call it this. So I was thinking about that in terms of the queer dactyls, because the queer dactyls have a lot of coded language. There's a lot of stuff in them that is highly autobiographical. It also interpolates a lot of things, not just from queer theory, from psychoanalysis. It borrows a lot of different things as a way to think about what is a language that we can think about as a future language, right? As a language that, as a neologism, a language that hasn't existed yet. And so I think of these queer dactyl poems as sort of functioning within that coded language. But I'm also thinking about something that I'm highly influenced by music, and something that I think about in terms of these queer dactyls is how in an album you have like interludes. I'm thinking specifically about an album like, she has a lot of them. Janet Jackson, right? She uses so many interludes in her work. Lauryn Hill, right, with Miseducation. These moments of what happens when, instead of focusing on the song, right, instead of focusing on the movie, we now turn the camera to the audience, right? And what do we hear the audience sort of say? What are they doing? What are they commenting, about what they're seeing? And so in a lot of ways, I would say that the queer dactyls are definitely commenting on the sort of realistic poems, and vice versa. And I think, and I was thinking about that with the concept of the interlude, right? These moments of when trauma gets extreme, when something becomes almost like unsayable, how do we then switch to chisme? How do we then switch to a different kind of realm by which we can talk about what's going on, but almost in coded language?
Yeah, I mean, and in keeping with that, I mean, the other note I had down, especially as you were reading them, was what's the meteor? What's and so how I mean, I think about it. There's an aspect to it, just kind of in this present closure and around. There's something There's something in your reading tonight where I thought, for lack of clear knowledge and clear news about what's happening, that culturally we create other ways of communication and of knowing or truth telling or truth testing, and that it's in many ways, those are things that we learn from our mothers, or from
No, that's a great. I think the meteor, even when I have to think about the function that it serves, it's definitely a multiple function. Sometimes it's thinking about heteropatriarchy. There are times when it's thinking about like neoliberal assaults. It's thinking about extraction. It's thinking about of land and people. It's thinking about genocide, and it's also thinking about there's the last queer dactyl poem where it's also thinking about how does the space of the club, especially for my generation, it served as a, you know, and I'm sure for other generations too,
Yeah.
how did it serve as a space by which we could sort of project a more honest version of ourselves, at the same time that it was a space where we had to navigate, right? We had to navigate the kinds of violences that were, you know, either entering into that space as well, or that were threatening from the outside. And so there's a lot of that in it. You know, I think about like who is assaulting whom in some of these poems, and yeah, it's definitely something working on different levels.
Roy, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
When you were conceiving of this sequence, the queer dactyl sequence, as interludes and as a group, and the way you were sort of creating this whole mythology, did you have any models in mind? I mean, do you consider it the latest addition to a particular lineage, at least this device of creating this sort of mythology that's sort of sequenced throughout the collection?
Absolutely. I kept thinking a lot about, you know, well, in thinking about my upbringing, I kept thinking a lot about how I grew up as a queer person in Miami. I think that maybe the very first space that was entirely queer that I attended, I was probably about 15. It was in a space that was actually next to a cemetery, right? So there's like this weird dichotomy. I've never written about that, but we ended up conceiving of having a prom, and we gathered all our resources to put together a prom, and it may have been one of the first proms ever, and or at least in this particular area of Miami. And a lot of, you know, like the drag ball scene is something that was incredibly influential to me. I participated in some of these, like, you know, competitions, or I was forced to. You know, it's like sort of like a rite of passage to go through these competitions. And I kept thinking about those memories a lot. And a film like Paris is Burning, it always reminds me of the joyfulness of being young, and also, you know, not really having any mentors, you know, and if you had mentors, they were maybe about a year or 2 years older than you. I was thinking about those figures a lot, but I was also thinking about, there's one club in, I don't know if it happened when you were growing up, Dan and Francisco, but the straight club that at night, or that in certain days became like the gay club, right? The queer club. So like on Tuesday, you know, Mondays, except for Tuesdays, it was straight night. And then you had a day where it would be, you know, queer night. And it's the same music. So you would have, you know, bachata, salsa, merengue. And literally what you would see on Mondays now gets queered on Tuesdays. And that to me was incredibly influential. I mean, I ended up becoming a ballroom dancer because of that sort of like exposure to music, to, you know, rhythms, so on and so forth. So I would say those are major influences in the book.
I do want to say we do have people kind of watching and listening in, and if you have questions for the Q&A period, make sure and sort of kind of put them in the comments. That will get to us. Roy, I had a question about when I was reading Marrow. You know, it took me a minute to kind of recognize it as X-Men, and then when I did, I got very excited because I'm like an old school X-Men person, and I love that aspect, that, you know, the thing about the Morlocks was that, you know, they lived underground. I know, you know, Marrow left. I mean, well, I'm not going to get into X-Men narrative stuff, but that aspect of kind of, you know, coming out of an underground. And as I recall, the power that she had, that Marrow had, was to basically, you know, her bones would sort of come out of her body, and then she would fashion those as weapons. So there's that aspect of it, which was, macabre, but it was also that was kind of the basis of her power. So I really loved, that's the thing about sort of kind of the X-Men. I mean, not the movie stuff as much, but that, it wasn't even an aspect of a queer reading. The reading was just, almost, at face value, it was just, so I really kind of love that sort of aspect of sort of kind of weaving that in as a foundational text. And so I was curious if, what was the process of kind of revisiting those texts? I'm assuming that, you grew up reading them, and then did, you revisited them to sort of kind of, I don't know. I mean, was it an issue of actually kind of going back to the source material? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one of the things that happened to me is I came to the US in December of 1994, and I was taken to Toys R Us. It was something like I'd never seen something like that before. I was sick, the plane, the flight, all of that. And I remember looking at these comics. I had never seen these things. I mean, in Latin America, in Central America, we have like paquines, like Condorito, so there's like these graphic texts are not sort of heroic. They deal with like everyday, bloopers kind of things. But I was in a Toys R Us, and I was just in awe to see this comic. And I remember that was one of the things that I bought. And of course I opened the pages and I couldn't read it. Right? I didn't speak English. And so, but I was able, with the images, right, alone, I was able to sort of project some kind of story onto this comic. And, over the years, I became like obsessed with them. And what I particularly loved about the character of Marrow is exactly as you pointed out, like sort of like the subculture within culture, right? She's sort of the othered other. She has a lot of drama with the character of Storm, and some of it is very queer as well. But you have Storm, who ends up being this sort of like highly symbolic, highly appreciated, popular character in the series. And then you have this woman, Marrow, who isn't just like producing these bones and using them as weapons, or for self-defense. Her hair is falling, right? She isn't really pleasant to look at, but she's so interesting in terms of thinking about not just queerness, but another thing that I was thinking about when writing these poems is disability, right? How does one deal with the mutant aspect of things? We think so much about the evolution of the mutant with being queer, but what happens when, how does the queerness, how do queer people negotiate disability? And I think she's one of them that really embodies this sense of like the macabre, the ugly, right? The unpopular. And she creates a name for herself.
Right.
So I love that. The idea that, not the idea, but the reality that queerness comes in so many different ways, and that also even the sub queer, cultures and communities, that they still have styles and ways to, demonstrate themselves, express themselves. So yeah, that's
and that aspect that makes you an outcast is actually your source of power, which is just, transgressively brilliant for a little queerling, who's kind of so last question on that. If Marrow were to sort of appear in the cinematic universe, who would you want to play Marrow?
Oh my goodness.
You don't have to immediately answer that. We can take that to social media.
I know, right? That's a good question. I mean, I was thinking about who can play, even a gust of wind, Meryl Streep, right? But
Meryl, yes.
I know Meryl. I don't know. That's a really interesting one. I think there's some really really amazing actresses like Charlize Theron who played Eileen Wuornos in Monster. The idea of just like hiding or not hiding but subduing these conventional notions of beauty in order to embody this character. Like, I think of someone like her.
Yeah. Well, because we've conceived of this evening's conversation as one around sort of queer poetics, I guess part of this conversation, I was wondering about the whole process of discovering, and this is to both of you, but your place in the lineage, and how and when that, I think what I wrote down was how that corresponds, caresses, conjoins with your own sense of multiple identities. And, we had, in one of our earlier conversations, we were talking, you had that experience, Francisco. I don't know if you want to tell the story again about the book fair and sort of
which book fair?
It was the Plasencia story about.
Yes.
I thought it was very fascinating. It was
So really briefly, it was the Guadalajara Book Fair in 2009. Salvador Plasencia, a Chicano writer, published an experimental novel called The People of Paper, and what he was grappling with during his panel discussion was how he felt a bit inadequate as a Chicano because his book didn't seem like it was the subject matter of the book, and the style of the book wasn't classically Chicano. So in the audience was Luis Rodriguez, the Chicano poet Luis Rodriguez, and he stood up and addressed Salvador and said more or less, my name is Luis Rodriguez. I'm as old school Chicano as you can get, and our struggles, we fought the good fight in the 60s and 70s so that people like you could feel free to write however you wanted. So don't doubt yourself. You're as Chicano as you come, and we celebrate you and we're proud of you. So don't worry about any of these questions that somehow they don't think that you're not Chicano enough. And I guess maybe that might be some of the things that possibly could be translated to queer poetics. As the new generations come, they're going to view that and deal with that in their own way without necessarily feeling that they have to fulfill a particular formula. I think there is a question in the chat box.
There was a question for Roy.
You mentioned how, by the way.
Huh? Come again?
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
I don't know, for some reason, like the images are like frozen for me. So.
Okay. Well, your audio is coming through fine.
Okay.
What's Roy's question?
It's a question for Roy.
Okay.
You mentioned how in one of the poems you read tonight, the ways in which we might find language for the unsayable. Could you talk more about how the poems in Catrachos speak to this?
Yeah. The unsayable. This is something that I have. I mean, the fact that I wrote a book about my queer experiences, I think, is in conversation with the unsayable. The fact that this book is about a queer, Catrachex, queer Honduran, queer Central American person, is also part of the unsayable. One of the things that I was thinking about too is I'm thinking about syntax. That's something where if I had to think about craft, that's where the unsayable comes up. Sometimes there's a lot of non sequiturs that take place in the poems, and it's not because I can't continue the poem, right? It's because sometimes I think that there is a dishonesty that sometimes happens when I'm in sort of like thinking about like, okay, my train of thought is leading me this way, but actually, in order to get to the next step, I have to go to it by way of something else. And so I feel like the unsayable becomes almost like this tangent, right? I gotta take a break. I gotta go and think about something else. Let me actually think about this image. Let me actually think about this sound. I am going through music, through sound, tell you a secret, but I'm not gonna be direct about it. And so I feel like the unsayable, at least in this book, is operating on those different levels, like in terms of syntax, in terms of secrecy as well, shame. Shame is a huge thing, a huge sort of theme in this book, and so yeah, like what happens when I'm trying to talk about shame, but I can't even bring myself to face it. I'm going to have to go a different way about it. And so the sayable takes me there, I mean, there's lots of ways to psychoanalyze, I think, not just a writer, but to psychoanalyze a book. And there's certain motifs, there's certain phrases that are also recycled, I would say, in the book. And they become moments to, again, think about, like, what is this text actually saying that perhaps becomes, a subtext.
Hearing you speak about it in those terms reminds me of a poem that influenced me for one of the poems in After Ruben. Robert Pinsky wrote this poem a number of years ago called Poem with Refrains, in which he intersperses snippets of Renaissance English poetry. And when he talks about that poem, he talks about it as a strategy to approach difficult subject matter. And in his case, it was the mental illness of his mother. And in my poem with citations from the OED, I sort of use an entry from the Oxford Dictionary as a vehicle to talk about my father and subtly his mental illness. So that's what I was thinking, that we use vehicles to talk about painful subject matter.
Yeah.
I read. Yeah.
Absolutely. And even thinking about your work, Francisco, which is something that I gravitate a lot towards your work, is not just the erasures that are happening, right? That sometimes perhaps the reader might know or not know, but also the form. Form also becomes a place where, by calling something a sonnet, but perhaps not seeing it or writing it in a sort of conventional sonnet form, you are in fact making an argument about something that is implied, about the subject matter, about the poem. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it becomes a container, or it's creating a container that can hold it, right?
Yes.
Or discovering it. The other image that sort of came to my mind was sort of in sculpture, the paring away the material, or negative painting, where you're actually not directly drawing the image, but drawing around the image.
Yeah.
So that, you sort of uncover where the subject is uncovered.
Dan, in an earlier question, I think you talked about, there's a question here. Question, what is the title? Someone's asking about the Robert Pinsky poem. The title of Robert Pinsky's poem is called Poem with Refrains. Poem with Refrains. But Roy, I want to ask you, I think Dan floated the question out there about lineage. And so when I think about my lineage in this area of queer poetics, I think of growing up in the Bay Area. The Robert Duncan was a really important poet to me. Jack Spicer was an important poet to me. At a certain point, Ginsberg. What about for you, Roy? Who were or are some important poets to you, queer poets who have been of particular, whose work has meant something to you as you forge ahead in your own projects?
Yeah, definitely Eduardo Corral. Eduardo Corral was a major inspiration, and it continues to be a major inspiration to me. your poetry, Francisco, is has been with me for a while, I would say, in terms of thinking about queerness. Gloria Saldúa,
Mm-hmm.
I can't. Gloria Saldúa is sort of like one of those texts where if I don't know what I'm doing, if I don't know where I'm going, I go back to that text. And I was also thinking about Langston Hughes,
Yeah.
James Merle, Elizabeth Bishop.
Mm.
I would say that Elizabeth Bishop is definitely one of the reasons why she's one of the main reasons why I even started writing poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of something that you do really well too, Francisco, is the blending of the creative with the research, right?
Yeah.
I would say that someone who does that for me or has taught me how to do that really well is Adrian Rich.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in Texas, I mean, the rest of the, there's the Ansaldúa is kind of interesting because she came later, but Ansaldúa is like one of the first kind of Latinx writers that really kind of resonated for me. And so I remember being on a panel a couple of years ago talking about basically about queer lineage. I can't remember what title we used, and Jericho Brown and I remember we had this kind of really interesting moment where Essex Hemphill's work came up,
Mm-hmm.
and he's a poet who sadly is not as well remembered as he should be,
Mm-hmm.
but certainly writing out of the Black gay experience. And yet for me, at the time when I didn't have access to any sort of queer Latinx writers, they just weren't, I wasn't aware of them. They certainly weren't, lifted up in a way. There was something about somehow connecting up with an experience that wasn't, I think Marlon Riggs uses the term, drowning in a sea of vanilla. And there was something about that aspect, that sort of kind of a creation of space, a building of not just queer space, but in that case, queer Black space.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of longing for the creation of queer Latinx space, that there's this sense of not that one space will ever hold the fullness of who you are, but that there are so many different spaces, to borrow Ansaldúa's terms, where your borderland, your crossroads identities can enter,
Mm-hmm.
and so it was much later for me, but it's now there's this kind of great overflowing. I'm also thinking about I wish I could remember. I think it was might have been, I don't think it was Norton, but there was the LGBT, I'm sure they didn't use T back then, but it was like the lesbian and gay anthology of poetry that I'm trying to remember the editor of that.
Yeah.
Anyway, just a fantastic volume. And I remember people like Harold Norris, whose work is really powerful. And and so just having access, coming across a book like that, which was just transformative, not because it showed a way, but multiple ways of sort of existing. You didn't just want one path, you wanted as many, to sort of realize you could sort of forge your own, or you could reach out and connect to all these different communities, these different liberationist streams.
Yeah. I should probably mention the essay I read from tonight is dedicated to someone I haven't mentioned in our conversation yet, and that's Francisco X. Alarcón. And he was also a big role model in terms of how to occupy.
Yeah, and I was
the space of being queer and Latinx at the same time.
Well, and I'm struck that the excerpt that you read about 2 paragraphs before, you shared something which was, as a sort of an exchange around sort of, we lost, Alarcón died 3 years ago?
2016.
4 years ago. Wow.
Yeah.
But that after he died, there was sort of this concern that
I was having a conversation. Shortly after he passed away, I was having a conversation with Rigoberto Gonzalez, and he was expressing to me a certain dismay in what he perceived as, in all the memorials and tributes to him, he perceived a certain muting or downplaying or not mentioning his queerness. It was sort of weighted towards his Chicano activism and his poetry, and he sort of perceived a muting of his queerness, when in fact what he was all about was trying to express those identities simultaneously, unapologetically, and together and intertwined. One did not need to sacrifice the other. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that lifts up just the reality that, we need to constantly be at this, because it seems like the default position is heteronormative. So unless we're pushing against that, then we run into a situation where our lives and our experiences are de-emphasized, are simplified. Really, I mean, the color is sort of pulled out of it, and we're left with this kind of uneven image. I think we need to sort of wrap up. I want to thank both of you for this conversation. I want to applaud Red Hen Press and Graywolf Press for making this evening's conversation possible. I hope it continues on in social media. I want to say too, please, I know that we have a lot of time for reading, and I want to say, yes, we were on the same. Sorry. That these two books, beloved, lovely people listening to the stream right now, these are for sale. They're available online. So please.
And they were both published on the same day. Roy and I both had the same publication date, May 5th.
Son primos or primos. So get a copy of Catarachos and After Ruben, and take care of one another.
Okay, thank you, Dan.
Find new ways to take care of one another. All right, stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye.
Much love.
All right.